And she turned to me one day and she goes, "Why do you keep asking me that? I don't know the answer." And I just said, one day you are going to look at me and you're going to have the answer. I said, that's what I'm waiting for. I'm waiting for her to move into that associative stage. So that's my comprehension check.
Hello, Erin, and welcome to Evidence Strong Show. It's my pleasure to have you. If you could please briefly introduce yourself.
Hey, my name is Erin Haff. I am a strength and conditioning coach and is also a weightlifting coach for about 32 years now, working with youth as high as professional athletes in a multiple of different types of sports, individual and team, ranging from high school to Division I, and like I said, to a professional netball team here in Australia, actually. I've been part of several resistance training studies and peer-reviewed publications, book chapters, designed to examine the impact of resistance training on performance, and have given many presentations, consultations, and work in the Australian Weightlifting Federation and the International Weightlifting Federation as an educator for teaching how to use weightlifting in weightlifting coaches, but also with outside of the sport of weightlifting, and how do you implement it in non-weightlifting competition. I have been appointed over 15 international coaching appointments for Australia. About 8 of those have been of a head coach and at international weightlifting competitions. So that's kind of where I am at right now. And I'm teaching at Edith Cowan University in the master's program and structurally working with how to teach weightlifting and its derivatives for sport and for non-competitive weightlifting. So all things weightlifting at this point.
Excellent, very impressive. So today we'll be talking about the paper titled National Strength and Conditioning Association Position Statement on Weightlifting for Sports Performance. So I interviewed Paul for the first part of the paper, where we discussed how to use weightlifting to coach in other sports, how to develop strength and speed and all this. So if anyone is interested, please go watch this one. It will be published by the time we publish this one. And today, Erin, I wanted to ask you all sorts of questions about how to coach and develop weightlifters. And we should start with the first thing, which would be, in general, how to teach weightlifting.
Well, there's 2 main pedagogical approaches that you can take that are most prominent out in the weightlifting world. One is called forward chaining, or a bottom-up approach. And the other is called reverse chaining, which is the top-down approach. Now, there's proponents for each strategy or approach that you would want to use. But let's take a look first at what each one is and what it proposes to do, and then we can kind of look at which one would be better. The forward chaining is where you take the skill, or you teach the elements of the skill in the order in which it would happen in the movement that you're working on. Whereas reverse, you're going to do it in the opposite direction. So the main argument for working in a forward is that it seems more logical because it's how the lift is progressed. For example, if I'm looking at a clean that you want to teach how to move to pick it up off the floor, how do you take it from the knee? How do you take it from the thigh? How do you catch it? Versus in a reverse, where we would go in the opposite direction. We start with a catch and work ourselves down to the floor. So they say it seems more logical, which in a way it is, in that sense. They justify it in that this skill is not, it's important to have the appropriate initial movement to be proper off the floor to enable you to do the rest of the skill or the movement properly. The problem with that is that other problems can be potentiated from just that initial movement. So the skill can, as it becomes more complex, as you move up the body, there's more room for error. And we'll go wrap back around to that when I get to the reverse chain, so you can see where I'm coming from with that. But as it becomes more complex, if it deviates or potentiates a problem and more errors, then you have a problem with the learning process as you complete those complex skills, or try to, and your performance outcome will not quite be as you probably had hoped. Therefore, it usually results in skills being executed in the initial stages really well. So that first lift off the floor is going to be really well because that's the first thing you've learned. But as you move up the body into more complex skills, that skill or those stages become, or the ability becomes more deteriorated and detrimental, where you're seeing more weaknesses occurring and faults in the process. When you reverse chain, which when you look at it in terms of how we learn in physical education, and I know we as a society, and this is a whole different, talk show, but that physical education has kind of gone a little bit off of a different path than what it used to be when I was in school. We learn a lot of things in our reverse chain. It's just a natural order of things. When we learned to shoot a basketball, we weren't taught from the 3-point line or the free throw line even. We were taught 3 feet away from the basket and learning how to bank shot off the backboard, and then we take steps backwards or way out, and as it becomes more complex. When I learned to play volleyball, when we were hitting, we weren't taught the approach and then how to hit the ball. We were taught how to hit the ball and then add in an approach to it. That's kind of the things that we're looking at. We're trying to use what's already been proven to work in a reverse chain. And that's where, and you can honestly tell by the way I'm talking that I tend to be a proponent of a reverse chaining method. But I think it's just the rationale for it is to provide lower complexity movements, because we're talking about teaching people how to lift. So we're not talking about people that already do weightlifting and have been doing it for a while. You're indicating that you want to talk about how do we teach somebody in a beginning, a novice. So you can have a novice can be somebody who is experienced in strength training, whether it's powerlifting, bodybuilding, whatever. They do strength training, even for a sport. But if they've not done a weightlifting movement, then they are considered a novice in that movement. So to teach that movement, we need to start with a lower complexity so that they have, in those early stages, to develop the right base patterns and then add complexity to that. So reverse chaining provides that for you, whereas forward chaining does not. And why I say that is because if we're talking about the progressions, which I know we'll get into a little bit later, so I'll just cover one example. If I'm going from an overhead squat, let's say, and teaching the snatch, and then I go into a snatch balance, the idea of when they catch in a snatch balance, they're in an overhead squat position, a position they've already trained. So they're familiar with it, they're comfortable with it. So that adds less stress, more chance for consistency and a better end product in creating that. Yes, there's going to be a few other areas because it's a new skill, but the actual movement into that overhead squat is easier because they know it. Whereas if I go in the opposite direction, they're going to go from a snatch balance to an overhead squat. They're going to something very fast moving into a lift that they have no idea how they've not done yet. So you have two lifts that are unfamiliar versus reverse chaining, where you have a lift that's familiar and you're coupling it in with a lift that is unfamiliar, so that there's a level of confidence going into that lift and it's less scary. I guess you can think of it in those terms. To optimize adaptation while currently laying a foundation for more complex movements. That's what we're looking at trying to do. And while adding more tools to that toolbox will enable us to put a better outcome or a better performance outcome and create that stability we need when you're looking at building a competent weightlifting movement. Positives for reverse chaining: there's less interference to occur. Like I said, you're not going to be stressed because you're thinking there's two movements that or one that I'm not real good at, but I'm moving into another one that I don't even know. This is the opposite. I'm taking one that I'm taking a movement I'm not really familiar with, but I'm moving into a position that I'm comfortable in. So it's just getting through that initial uncomfortable movement part when you're adding that new skill into that older skill that you're already familiar with. So they're taking that interference out by doing it in a reverse order. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
What I have found in my experience is if I work in reverse, it's more logical to that athlete, because they're moving into some. Human beings don't like ambiguity most of the time, especially when you have to physically go into something that you've never done before. They like some degree of certainty. And by going in a position where you're going through lifts and adding something into something they already know provides a level of confidence and comfort and less anxiety, and therefore creates a better outcome in the long run, in my opinion. And that's what the NSCA also advocates, because it has been scientifically proven to be a little bit more effective.
Okay, so now we decided which approach we will use. How do we decide when we should move to another phase? So in other words, how to chain the skills to get the lift at the end?
So, an athlete is ready. There's kind of three key things. There's a lot of things that go on, but there's three key things that I look for when I'm coaching. When you're going to chain two elements together, you want to make sure that both elements are fairly consistent. You don't want to necessarily marry two exercises where one is super strong and the other is like, you can't even tell what that exercise is, when you're watching, you're like, ooh, what's he trying to do, or something. You want to make sure that there's consistency in both exercises before you pair them together. You want to demonstrate a fluency in those. And fluency, I mean, is to perform without hesitancy or massive thought process going into the lift. If you've coached long enough, you can tell when an athlete's thinking while they're lifting. And there's definite movement, a degradation of fluency within the movement. You can see them actually like thinking. It's not like they're not trying. They're taking it centimeter by centimeter by centimeter all the way up because you're overanalyzing basically. So you're looking for fluency in both lifts. And that comes back also to that consistency. If they're confident and a majority of the technical aspects are consistently met, they will move with fluency. So you want to make sure that's also happening. So technical proficiency in both, fluency in both, and then that they respond to instruction or feedback well when it comes to body position or movement, or even body to bar movement, or bar to body, which probably would be better, and that they respond to that. Because if they don't understand something, they're not going to respond well. They're going to try, but they might not actually have it. So if you're asking them to keep the bar close to their body and they cannot do it, that's going to affect the rest of the performance of the lift and ultimately the outcome. So then they're probably not ready. If they can't do it in one, but they can do it in the other, then we got to wait a little bit until that other one is a little bit more, they can respond a little bit better. And you always have to keep in mind too, when you chain things together, there is going to be timing issues that will occur no matter what level you're looking at. There's going to initially be some tiny timing issues that go on because they're trying to put two things together. They're not just focusing on one now and then going to another. They're trying to put them both together. So it takes a little while, and it depends, of course, on the athlete. One of the hardest skills I have found for a novice is to do a snatch balance. And it's not the heaving where you get to use your legs. This is where you just punch and sit. And it's all a timing thing where you go in from dropping under the bar into an overhead squat. What I've found is, for example, with the snatch balance, if I want them to, and then they're learning it for the first time, we've gone through the key points or whatever, especially if I'm in an education setting when I was teaching in the undergrad. So I show them what I want, which is always important. Show them what you want. You name it so that every time they see it, they understand what it is you're doing. Or if you ask for it, they can recall after a time, they'll remember it. The younger they are, the longer it takes. I usually get them to do, and I wouldn't do more than 3 reps. But this is the example I would give, is saying, instead of saying, okay, we're going to do a set of 3 and then correcting everything right off the bat because I'm seeing all these things go wrong, I give them like 3 or 4 sets of 3. And I just let the first 2 sets, I don't say anything. I just let them muddle their way through it. And then literally 9 times out of 10, about the 3rd set, definitely the 4th, they're really starting to put that timing element together. But yeah, those 3 things are pretty much key. Technical consistency, fluency and proficiency, and effective response to any feedback that you are giving. But it has to be for both exercises or all 3 if you're chaining 3 exercises into your complex.
Awesome. Okay, we arrived at progressions and regressions. This is your strength because you have an enormous experience in teaching. So I'm super curious to hear, how do you decide how to progress and how to regress with examples? that would be, I think, very, very valuable for all the coaches to hear.
So when you're working, again, I work from a top-down approach. So I'm working the 5 phases of the lift. I'm working from the 5th down to the 1st. So I'm going to work the catch and recovery first, and then I'm going to do the second pull transition and first pull. Okay, so let's take, for example, because it's sitting right in front of me here, I'll just add the progression in front, the snatch progression. So in a snatch progression in the recovery, we have the behind the neck press and an overhead squat. Both are very controlled movements, slow moving, easier skills. There are strength skills, by the way, but easier skills to manage before we start adding speed by going into a snatch balance. Now, if I've got an athlete and I establish their snatch grip and we're going through the behind the neck press, and I'm seeing that there is an issue with mobility, that's when I start having a regression in that I will change the range of motion for them. Now, technically, we teach it to press from the top of the cervical spine or on top of the traps, basically, to full extension and then coming back down. But if there's an issue, whether it's due to an injury, a past injury, or something they're dealing with where, they're having problems with either a shoulder, the lat, the elbow, whatever, and they can only come down, say, to the top of the back of the head, then we'll work that range of motion until, and then on the side, be doing things to help with the mobility issues until we can start getting the bar to lower back down. And we can have other exercises in there as well, to auxiliary exercises to help strengthen those areas as we try to keep attacking that mobility issue. I tell anyone I'm ever teaching how to coach, never ever change correct technical positions to accommodate someone's immobility or inflexibility. So if we have to change range of motion in order to get even just a partial movement of it, if you have someone doing an RDL and their hamstrings are so tight, which I've seen this, where they can't even get halfway down their thigh, then that's as far as we go until we can move and work on the side, all these things to get those hamstrings and lower back and glutes to loosen up so that we can get that full range of motion in the RDL. I'm not going to change it and allow them to bend their knees or drop their hips in order for them to get the bar down to the proper below the knee position, because then when they do get mobile and flexible or healthy, if it's an injury, then I have to correct what we just spend weeks or months or sessions allowing them to do so that they feel like they can go below their knees and get into the proper depth of the position. The best thing you can do initially is change the range of motion if there's an issue there, but keep the correct positions that they need to be in, hip height, back positions, whether it's straight, don't allow it to round so that they can do something to get into another position. It's only going to hurt you in the end. You're going to spend way more time on the back end trying to fix what you allowed at the beginning, and it probably will not totally get fixed because they're going to go back to what they know or what they've been allowed or what they've strengthened in the beginning. So that's going to end up coming back and kicking you in the butt, basically. So you want to make sure that it's done correctly from the get-go. Regressions, for example, there's different ones in each of the progression tables that I've put, or figures that I put in there. Your snatch pull at the knee. When we're doing this, science is pretty ambiguous, I think, in terms of they just say at the knee. They don't say where at the knee you're going. So some people interpret that as above and some people interpret that as below. I tend to go below. I understand the merits of going above, but one thing that we're trying to teach as they come from the floor up is that they've got to wait to accelerate the bar till they pass their knees. So if they're always training knee positions above the knee, it seems like it's like that would be easy. They just push it out of the way. But when you've got loads or you're, under stress or you're thinking about all these other things, simply just moving your knees back is not as simple as it sounds. So my husband and I coach a team together. We train our athletes to pull from below the knee so that they're learning to wait that extra however many centimeters it is to get past their knee. So they have to stay over the bar longer before they can start accelerating into that second pull position. So regressions For example, if I have someone with a hamstring or a tight back issue, which I've actually experienced myself, but this was after years of already training, my regression from the RDL was to then take it from above the knee, because going that extra little bit was putting too much stress on my back injury. So I understand those regressions, as long as I also make sure my athlete understands that it's that, and I wouldn't call it necessarily regression, because you know, certain athletes, you have to know your athletes pretty well. Some athletes don't handle the fact that they think that they're, I don't know, being treated with kid gloves and they don't want to be, or they're having to do something that nobody else has to do because of some inability. So you have to be careful about how you address this with your athlete. But I'm always 100% honest with, not saying other people aren't, but I tend to be 100% honest. And I'll just say, look, we're going to go from here from now because X, Y, and Z. And while we fix this other thing, then we'll get back to this. It's not a problem. You're not going to have any issues here. We're still working this. You're still going to get strong. You're still going to, you know, letting them know that this is all part of a plan and that it's not a deficiency for them, or it won't become one. And that's a big issue when you do a regression, is to make sure that they understand that it's just until we address an issue. And this issue is going to be done by doing this, this, and this, so that they're brought in to make them accountable for the progression of this. We can progress when this gets better. So if that requires, for an example, an athlete to do mobility work outside of training time, then that's where that accountability comes onto them, saying, if you want to progress, then we need to be doing X, Y, and Z while these regressions are happening, so that that we can get off the regressions and move into the progression itself.
So if we could, just for clarity, go through how the progressions you would imagine go for snatch and for clean.
Yeah. So in a snatch and clean, your phases are the same. So you're going to have a full lift. So you're going to have a first pull, which is from the floor to, scientifically speaking, the floor to the bottom of the knee, or the bottom of the kneecap. Then you have a transition phase, which is from that bottom of the kneecap up to the high thigh position. Not necessarily the crease, but that's a whole different talk show. If you want me to talk about that, I will. But it is the high thigh position. And then the second pull to extension. So that is the high thigh to that full extension of the traps. And then you have catch and you have recovery. So the catch is where you're catching it in that half roll. On the snatch, you're going to be in a semi-squatted overhead squat position, and then standing up is the recovery. Clean, you're catching it in that partial squat position of a front squat, and then the standing up is the recovery. Okay, so to work those, if we go in reverse order, and we'll start with the snatch. So to work recovery, and then this goes in the order of the progression that we're actually doing, we're going to do a behind the neck press in the snatch grip, and then we're going to do an overhead squat. Okay, to work the catch is kind of the overhead squat, but more the snatch balance. So we worked from a behind the neck press to an overhead squat to a snatch balance. So you can see we've gone from a controlled to a semi-controlled, well, it's still controlled, but it's moving, to a faster moving exercise. So we've prepped the snatch balance by giving those two controlled things to help them get ready for that speed. And it's strength elements. You always follow a power element. You precede a power element with a strength element, so that we know that they're strong enough to withstand that speed and the power to be able, yes, you're going to have some timing issues in the beginning, like I've said before, but you'll be able to control those because you've worked some strength stuff before they've gotten into that. So behind the neck press, overhead squat, snatch balance, and then we move to the front and we'll do a snatch grip pull from the power position. So that high thigh to the shrug position. Then we move to a power snatch from the power position. So again, we preceded the power movement with the strength movement. So we taught them how to pull to that. Now we pull into the catch. Then we move down the body into the transition phase. You'll be doing snatch pull from the knee, and we always just say at knee in the stance, because it leaves it open, which we as is regression to either go above or below. It's the choice of the coach. I tend to go below. So we're going snatch bit pulls from the knee or below the knee in my case. My athletes know that, so they just automatically go there. And then you go into a power snatch from the knee position. And then we go into first pull work. Then you're going to do a snatch pull, lift off only. So you're going from the floor to just to the bottom of the knee, or wherever your transition starts. Okay. So if your coach starts the transition above the knee, then they will pull from the floor to just that start above the knee. And then you do a snatch pull from the floor all the way up to the shrug. So we're putting all those pieces together. You're piecing the first pull with the transition with the second pull. So there's your chaining going on right there in the progression. And then you go to a full lift. Now, the full lift ultimately is to be a snatch if you're teaching weightlifting, but we actually go to a power snatch first to teach the movement of a power snatch. And then we start coupling power snatch with an overhead squat. And the reason we don't go right into, per se, into the squat snatch, is because it depends on the athlete. So if you have an inconsistency in terms of how they move their feet when they go into a catch position, I don't want them to practice dropping into a full snatch when their feet aren't moving appropriately. So I have them actually power snatch it, adjust their feet, and then overhead squat it. And as they get more consistent at jumping their feet to the proper position, the transition time between those two lifts gets smaller and they end up squat snatching. And then they've gone into a squat snatch. Now, how fast that happens depends on the athlete. I've had some, like I said, 10-year-old that did it in 2 reps, 1 rep. I had a 21-year-old who could do all the movements beautifully. And we went to chain them together and she would not sit down. And it took a year for her to sit down when you're doing the actual lift itself. When she did it, it went. But it's not a physical limitation there. I think for her, it was mental. There was a fear factor in the speed of that she was afraid of. And eventually she got over that. So that's something you also have to identify when you're going through with your athletes. Now, when you go to a clean, a lot of the progression stuff will be very similar. Obviously, the catch and recovery is going to be different because we're not going overhead. So we're not pulling all the way through to over top. We're catching on the shoulders. So the catch and recovery is a front squat. So we're starting our progression with a front squat. And the beauty of that is because front squat is one of those basic lifts that we teach early on before we even get with youth athletes. I'm not jumping right into Olympic lifting. So I'm doing squatting technique, pressing technique, maybe even some pulling technique in there, but the rest of it's all very simple strength and conditioning exercises. We're not looking at trying to snatch them in the first, year that they're there, but we're taking elements of that progression. So we're starting with the front squat, and then the second pull will work pulls from the power position, and then power cleans from the power position. So a lot of this, except for the grip, now is identical to the snatch. So this moves a lot faster. We always start with the snatch. It's more technically difficult. It takes longer. But if we can get them through, I tend to look at it this way. If they'll stick with me through the snatch as I take them through a snatch progression, because the clean is going to go like that. Even when I'm teaching it in a course, it takes me perhaps a full 2 outside, maybe 2 hours and 20 minutes to teach the snatch, a power snatch. We go to the clean, it takes me half the time. If I reverse that, it's going to take me longer. It's going to take me a while to do the clean, but then it's going to take me a while to do the snatch because of the grip and the going overhead. So if I start with the more difficult one, then the other ones become very simple, and it's much easier to move through those progressions. So like I said, transition will be clean pulls from the knee, above or below is up to the individual coach, and then your power cleaning from the knee. And then we're moving to the first pull, like we did in the snatch. You're going to do a lift off only. So you can go floor to wherever the knee position is for you. And then you're going to do full pulls from the floor all the way up to the shrug. So you're again chaining the first pull, transition, and second pull together. And then we're going to a power clean, ultimately a clean. So like the snatch, where we did a power snatch plus overhead squat, in a clean, we can do a power clean plus a front squat. And the key there is to make sure, again, that the feet are moving appropriately to the proper stance position. And once they are, that transition between those two lifts becomes minimal, and they start actually just squat cleaning because they're just going right into the proper position.
We're ready to move to the jerk.
Yes. So jerk. There's a couple ways that we can do the jerk. All the exercises will be the same. It's just in terms of the order. And again, that just will depend on coaching philosophy and or most likely how the athlete is responding to what you're doing. So the typical way, which is the IWF certified a recognized way, which the NSCA agrees with, and they agree with both of these, but I have a progression, but I have an alternative. So the progression that they're looking at, and again, we're going in recovery, catch, slightly different phases now. We have a recovery, a catch, a drive, and a dip. Okay, so if we go, and that's in the reverse. So if we're going in proper order, forward chaining, you're looking at you've cleaned the bar, so now you're sitting here. You are going to dip, drive, catch, and then recover with your feet, right? So we've gotten into 4 phases versus the 5 that we have with the snatch and the clean. Recovery is worked with a clean grip behind the neck press, because now it's clean because we've gone from a clean and jerk. So whatever your jerk grip is, which for most people should be the same as their clean and their front squat. Some people tend to move a little bit wider for ease, as they're, like Cameroonians, they jump their hands out or whatever. Okay, that is an exception. Not many people do that. So, but it is out there. But you basically want your grip to be wherever it is you're going to be catching the bar in the front, but now we're in the back. So you're going to do a behind the neck press, and then you're going to do a military press from the front. So you're going to follow the behind the neck with a movement in front. And this is kind of how it's going the whole way through. We're going to do it in the back first, whatever we're doing, and then we're going to move it to the front and do the same exact thing. Now, these aren't things, by the way, that happen when we give a progression. That doesn't mean that all these things are happening in one session. We can move them in different ways, and that's a different programming thing I definitely can discuss at some point, but I'm just laying out what the order tends to be, and then how it's implemented would be up to the training style and the abilities of the athlete and where they are in their training. So we've gone behind the neck press to a military press in front. Then we go behind the neck and do a push press. Then we come in the front and do a push press. Then we go behind the neck and do a push jerk. Then we come in front and do a push jerk. The idea behind going back and forth like that is the idea that when it's behind, you're teaching them how to drive straight, because if their elbows are cocked back or they're pushing forward, it's going to hit their head, and the bar is going to, then start doing this. It's teaching them to drive straight up with their body, and then you move it to the front and they know how to drive straight up, but they also then have to work on getting it into that back position in that back half of the head. So you're kind of chaining in a way, in that you're taking a position they know they need to be in behind their head, and then they've got to push and get it back to behind their head. So that's their idea behind that. After the push jerk in the front, you're going to do some footwork. So you're going to teach them how to go into a split. So everything up to this point has been with their feet underneath them, or in a pushing stance or a jumping stance, basically. And then they go into split work. And then they go into a split jerk is the idea. So if you go from behind, and then you can go from the front. Now, an alternative to that, which is what I tend to use, everything behind the neck first, and teach them how to get them and use that strength, because they're not very strong, obviously, at younger ages. Not very many of them have strength backgrounds. So we use a lot of time to develop, because weightlifting is very posterior chain. So I'm trying to build that posterior chain before I move them to the front, which is going to be a weaker position potentially for them. So we do a lot of stuff where we do all the movements from behind first. So we'll be behind the neck press, behind the neck push press, behind the neck push jerk, and then we do split work, and then we do a press in the split. So we go back to a behind the neck press, but their legs are in the split while they're pressing. So they're not jumping into it. They're placed into the split, and then they're pressing. And then we go into a split jerk behind the neck. Then we go into military press. So everything comes to the front now. So we go military press, push press from the front, push jerk from the front. They've already learned the footwork, so we don't have to review that again. Or you can review it, but you don't have to actually teach it again. And then they go from a split jerk in the front. And it's pretty simple. It's only been maybe I want to say 6, 7, 8 years that they've actually formalized a progression for the jerk.
Could we stop and have a definition of transition and auxiliary exercises? What they are.
So transition exercises are used to help in the development of appropriate sequencing. Okay, so like I said, if I'm doing a pull, but I'm having trouble doing the power movement that follows it in the progression, I have a transitional exercise that comes between them that has elements of the first part and elements of the second part, so that we can hopefully bring those a little closer together. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Could we go through some other example?
Yeah. So if one of the things I gave early on when I talked about the progression of the jerk is when you've gone from push jerking and you've learned the split, where do your feet go in a split? Because they're not jumping into it, we're placing it so they can feel where the stress is in their body, their legs, or the hips, wherever it might be for that individual. And then what we might do, instead of just going right into a split jerk, whether it's front or behind, doesn't matter, is we can put them in the split and then do a strict press from there. So they learn how their body needs to be positioned equally between the front and the back, upright, and how the bar gets into that overhead position, pushing up through the upper back. If you do that in a really fast movement without actually having isolated that, that might be things that you find there will be things that you will find your athlete will do initially. They're going to put most of their weight onto the front foot. They're going to lean more with the chest. Or if you say sit back, they'll actually, instead of sitting back with their weight in their legs, they arc their back and just lean back with their upper back. They push forward with the bar, or they just push up and they stabilize with straight arms, but they don't use the upper back to stabilize the bar overhead. So those are things that's an exercise that you can, some coach might see that as a regression. It's not. It's a way to transition from working a foot split position into an actual split jerk movement. All right. So we're actually doing an intermediate step by placing them in there, not jumping into the split. They're placed into it and then doing a strict press from there. And then we reiterate as they're from their last rep, their recovery. They bring their feet in appropriately, recovering front foot to back foot, bring the bar down, then they put it back in. So you're using all these different exercises to reiterate things that are important aspects that are secondary or tertiary to what you're actually working on. So you're subliminally working something on the athlete's viewpoint, because they're like, oh, well, they don't realize that necessarily that's recovery. They're just saying that's how we're supposed to get our feet back to bring the bar back down. And then if we keep doing that, then that's how they realize that that's how they're supposed to be doing it. Transition is always about developing appropriate sequencing. So it's not about necessarily developing the strength to do the movements. That's an auxiliary lift. So you're using auxiliary lifts to supplement the lifts to create the strength you need to be in the positions you need to get into. The transition is a way to take, like I said, a partial movement pattern from one exercise they do well and part of an exercise that they're struggling with, and it's in the middle. So it's kind of like where my pinkies are meeting. And that's the transition exercise. And we're trying to get that marriage between the two by linking them with a common exercise or something that has enough commonalities to be able to put both of those two together.
Okay, and I think it brings us nicely to the stages of learning.
Yeah.
And how they go, because now we will see how it changes for the athlete.
Yeah. So in your beginning stages and how long, and these aren't like cut and dry. You aren't going to be like, oh, you're going to be in the cognitive stage for like 6 months, and then you're going to transition to this for another 3 months, and then you're going to be here, or something like that. It's not like that. Everyone is individual. You don't know. You just have to look for the signs and address the signs that you're seeing. So on a cognitive learning and motor skills, the cognitive stage is characterized by very inconsistent and inefficient performance, basically. Okay. They might have, if they're doing 5 reps, 1 or 2 might look good, but the rest are, like you're getting like out of a set of 5, you might be getting 3 different techniques going on there, where 3 of the reps or 2 of the reps are the same. And then you're getting some other ones in there. It's just changing. So that fluctuation is always happening because they're not actually acquiring or acquisitioning the skill yet. It's a slower movement and they're more deliberate because they're thinking. And that is, you can't get rid of that part. You can't just say, just don't think, because they're trying to, especially, any novice, but I have found that especially with children, because children want to please adults. So when I'm working with my 8 to 10-year-olds, or 7 to 10-year-old, actually, they're going to try to do every single thing I ask them to do, and they want to do it very well because they want me to be happy. So I have to be very specific about what I'm looking for and very limited on what I'm looking for. I cannot give them a lot of things because they'll try to do it all. And then they'll get frustrated because they can't, because they're in the cognitive stage. They're learning, they don't know. And so those movements they're going to be thinking. And that thought process is important, but it is also extremely fatiguing. It's actually sometimes even more fatiguing than the physical. And it just adds to, if they're already physically fatigued, depending on their fitness level coming in, it's just adding to that fatigue. So going to lots of reps or lots of sets is actually not conducive for someone at that level, because they're already getting fatigued and they're not going to perform well the more fatigued they are. And you can say, well, we want to toughen them up and so that they'll work through fatigue and do it, but they're not at the stage where they should be doing that yet. And also at the stage, they are unable to use internal feedback or kinesthetic feedback effectively. There are exceptions. Like I said, the 10-year-old that just plopped right into a squat snatch. He was actually, now he didn't know what he was doing at the time, but he knew he just went down there. And then he just looked at me and immediately, even though it was done well, immediately apologized. And he's like, but you told me to stop and I didn't stop. I'm so sorry. I'll do it again. That's what I'm talking about. Kids want it. I'm like, no, we're good. We're good. Don't worry about it, because they're thinking about what you've asked of them. So we do have to realize, obviously, the younger they are, the more you have to be like water. You have to be fluid when you're working with them, because things are going to go cattywampus in a second, because they're kids. So this stage requires more external feedback. Now, when you give it and what you give, we'll get into that in a little bit later, but it does require a lot more feedback. And this is the stage, as well as the associative, which I had said before, that the coach needs to be present. Okay. So, because they don't know what they're doing. They don't know what they're not doing. So that's up to us to categorize, to find specifically what we want them to work on. And that's what they focus on. There may be 10 things going wrong, but we can't give them 10 things to work on. So we have to decide as a coach, where am I getting the most bang for the buck? And those are the things I'm going to focus on. The others might be corrected because I fixed these 2 things. So we do have to be cognizant of that. When you go to the associative stage, the movement becomes much more fluid. Okay. And remember that fluid means that there's no real hesitancy, and there's a confidence in the movement pattern. Like they know what they need to go to or need to do. There's an efficiency there. Some parts are going to be more automatic. You're still going to have some struggling in certain things. They're not going to be perfect yet. They're still going to have and now we have 5 reps. We've got 3 or 4 of them that look more of the same, but we still have 1 or 2 that are these outliers that we're not sure. Then we have to look at what are the mistakes that are happening. If it's the same thing, then that's obviously something we need to address. Less thinking is required. That's why things are more automatic looking, because they don't have to think as much. They're more comfortable with what they're doing. They know what needs to happen to a certain extent. They still will require some mental attention on certain things. Most of the time it's finishing the pull, pushing through the upper back, or stabilizing the midsection in the catch. Those are some big things that we find with novices or even intermediates, that they kind of relax those things because they're thinking of something else and trying to get them to get multiple things happening at the same time. They're at a stage now where they can start to try to do that. Their internal feedback will start to kick in now. They will sense what is right and wrong, or proper and improper. They might not know how to fix it yet, but they know that it's not right. I get a lot of times where athletes they'll do something and look at me and they're like, that rhythm was off. I'm not sure what I did, but that wasn't quite right. What didn't I do? Or what did I, where did I go wrong? Their internal feedback kicks in. Their kinesthetic awareness is better. They still need help to ID. Like I said, they still will need help to identify what needs improving. That isn't to say that when you start with, you want to start asking those questions with a cognitive athlete. Like, how does that feel? Did that feel different? If they did 2 reps and the second one's really good and the first one wasn't as good, did you feel a difference between the first and the second rep? and I've always said this too. I was like, you might not have, and that's okay. That's okay. I'm just asking. They'll move into the autonomous stage, which is where you find most of your advanced athletes. And when I say advanced, some people think, oh, I've been at it 2 years, I'm advanced. I'm like, my coach told me when I was training, I was 4 years in and we were doing high pulls for the first time. And I asked him, because some of the athletes that were in there had a much higher training age than me. And I just said, well, why do I get to do those now? Because I'd seen them doing them. And I said, why do I get to do those now? I mean, why are we starting now? And he said, because you're at a stage where your pulls are consistent. So I know if I ask for a certain difference in this pull, I can get it. He said, and it's an advance. Therefore, to me, he said, and which has become to me, because it makes sense to me anyway, that a high pull is an advanced movement. So I don't give that to novices, and I don't even give it to intermediates. I want them, as they're moving more towards an autonomous stage, then I'm going to start throwing that in, because I know then that there's a proficiency in the movement pattern, so much so that they're not even having to think, because they can do it like in their sleep. Then I can make changes that are more radical to that pull, and it's not going to phase them too much. But what I mean by that, so in advanced, to me, I was 4 years in, and I asked the coach, I said, so am I advanced then? And he laughed at me. He goes, no, you're still a fetus, honey. And I just said, oh, okay. What? So when you get to the autonomous stage, you're looking at the motor movements are well defined. They're well ingrained. The movement is smooth. It's accurate, for the most part. I mean, so you can have little idiosyncrasies, but they're very accurate. And the consistency, and there's little mental attention. Like they could do this movement in their sleep. Thought processes can shift then from how am I moving, how am I completing this lift, to the smaller, more idiosyncrasy things that happen in the lift that they need to make sure they're doing, like stretching or fast hands or punching or, whatever. So they can focus on the minutia instead of the lift as a whole. And so basically your feedback is then geared more towards the fine tuning of a lift versus improving to make a whole holistic correction. You're in fine-tuning movements, fine-tune movement issues, smaller movement issues, to improve efficiency of the overall lift, which seems like, well, we're doing that the whole time, but this is at the other ones are a little grander scale. We're looking at the whole body, but focusing on a few things to try to get the whole body to move. Whereas this one, we know the whole body is going to move just fine. Now we're going to just pinpoint certain things that they're not as consistent with. But those are basically those 3 stages, and you're going to move through them. Like I said, there's no cut and dry, this is only going to last so long, and then you're going to do it here. It depends on the person. And so you just have to keep working within the stage that they're in.
The 2 short questions. One is your favorite color.
There's actually 2.
Okay.
I like blues and greens.
Noted. So I usually make an infographic to go with the interview. So I need the colors. And I think it's a nice thing to have them in the color you like. So.
Oh, thank you.
And the other question is, if people want to find out more about you or contact you, where should they go?
Well, I'm not a big social media person, so I know I'm archaic when it comes to that stuff. I do have a Facebook, but that's more just, it's not work related. LinkedIn is probably the better way.
Okay.
Or that Gmail account, because people ask questions, I try to answer them. So, but that's probably the better way to do it. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the conversation.